Hello everyone, welcome to the Mysterious Stories channel, where you'll discover the most mysterious, scary, and fascinating stories. Make sure to turn up the volume and get ready for a spine-chilling experience you won't forget. Firebase Ripcord, June 28, 1970. The air was thick with the smell of burning foliage and the sharp, acrid stench of gunpowder. The Huey helicopter descended through the canopy of dense jungle, the rotors kicking up a storm of debris as it neared its landing zone. Below, Firebase Ripcord sprawled out like a wounded beast, its trenches and sandbags barely visible through the smoky haze that clung to the hills. Sergeant Mac McAllister, a battle-hardened veteran with more than his fair share of close calls, adjusted his helmet and glanced around at the men seated next to him. Their faces were set in grim determination, each of them aware that they were heading into a hellish fight that had already claimed many lives. The mission had been briefed just days earlier on June 25, 1970. At the main base camp, they were to reinforce the embattled Firebase Ripcord, a strategic outpost deep in the Ashau Valley, where the North Vietnamese army had been relentlessly pounding the American troops. Just another day in the jungle, Mac muttered to himself, though he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at him since they'd received the orders. There was something different about this mission, something the brass hadn't mentioned. June 28, 1970, day of departure. The team, consisting of Mac, Corporal Jeff Jinx Johnson, Specialist Danny Doc Martinez, and Private First Class Charlie Rabbit Thompson, had been selected for their experience and camaraderie. They'd been through hell together before, and Firebase Ripcord would be no different, at least that's what they told themselves. As they stepped off the helicopter and onto the dusty ground of the Firebase, they were greeted by Captain Henry Hank Roberts, the commanding officer of the base. Hank was a grizzled veteran with a reputation for being tough as nails, but even he looked worse for wear. "Glad you boys could make it," Hank said, his voice strained. "We've been getting hammered day and night. And it's not just the NVA we're fighting." Mac frowned. "What do you mean by that, sir?" Hank hesitated, his eyes flicking towards the charred remains of what had once been a barracks building. "We've been seeing things out here, things that shouldn't be here. I don't know if it's the jungle, the stress, or if we're all just losing our minds ... but something's out there." Later that night, after a hastily prepared meal and a quick check of their gear, the team gathered in the command bunker for a more detailed briefing. The atmosphere was tense, the dim light from the single overhead bulb casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. Captain Roberts outlined their primary objective: to hold Firebase Ripcord and prevent the NVA from overrunning it. The enemy was entrenched in the hills surrounding the base, and the chances of survival were slim. But then Roberts leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And then there's the secondary objective," he said, his eyes narrowing. "There's something out there in the jungle, something our men have been seeing at night. A ghost. Some say, others think it's a spirit of the mountain, angered by all the bloodshed. Whatever it is, it's been killing our boys, and it doesn't leave a trace." Mac exchanged uneasy glances with his men. They had all heard stories like this before, tales of vengeful spirits, of soldiers who never made it home, still wandering the jungles. But here, in the darkness of Firebase Ripcord, those stories felt all too real. "Tomorrow at dawn, you're heading out on patrol," Roberts continued. "Your job is to find out what's out there and, if you can, eliminate it. We can't afford to lose any more men to whatever this is." The first night at Firebase Ripcord was restless. The distant sound of artillery and the occasional burst of gunfire echoed through the hills, but it was the eerie silence that followed each volley that unnerved the men the most. As the hours ticked by, Mac found himself unable to sleep. The captain's words replaying in his mind. At around 2 o'clock hours, a thick fog began to roll in from the jungle, creeping into the firebase like a living thing. Mac, who had been keeping watch with Jinx, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The fog seemed to carry with it a sense of dread, as though the very air around them was heavy with unseen eyes. Then came the sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. It was a low, mournful wail that seemed to rise and fall with the wind. Mac stiffened, his hand instinctively going to the rifle slung across his chest. "Do you hear that?" Jinx whispered, his voice barely audible over the keening noise. Mac nodded, his eyes scanning the fog-shrouded perimeter. "Yeah, and I don't like it." The wail grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was making it was getting closer. The fog thickened, and for a moment, Mac thought he saw a shadow moving just beyond the wire, a fleeting glimpse of something that shouldn't be there. "Jinx, stay sharp," Mac ordered, his voice tense. "Whatever that is, it's out there and it's watching us." As the night dragged on, the wailing eventually faded, but the sense of foreboding lingered. When dawn finally broke, the fog lifted, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. But the men of Firebase Ripcord knew better. The jungle had eyes, and something in those hills was not of this world. Mac knew one thing for certain: this mission was going to be like nothing they had ever faced before. June 29, 1970. The morning sun barely penetrated the thick canopy of the Ashau Valley as Sergeant Mike Mac McAllister and his team prepared to leave the relative safety of Firebase Ripcord. The jungle was a wall of impenetrable green, dark and silent except for the occasional distant rumble of artillery. The memory of the previous night's wailing still clung to the men like a cold sweat, but there was no turning back now. "All right, listen up," Mac said as he gathered his men around him. Corporal Jeff Jinx Johnson, Specialist Danny Doc Martinez, and Private First Class Charlie Rabbit Thompson looked at him with a mix of determination and unease. "Our mission today is straightforward. We're going out on a patrol to find out what's been haunting this place. Stay sharp and keep your heads on a swivel. Whatever's out there, it's not playing by the usual rules." The team checked their gear one last time: rifles, grenades, medical kits. Every piece of equipment was vital, but no amount of preparation could fully arm them against what might be lurking in the jungle. The team set out just after dawn, their boots crunching softly on the jungle floor. The air was thick with humidity, each breath like inhaling water. The sounds of the firebase quickly faded behind them, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the jungle. As they moved deeper into the valley, the trees seemed to close in around them, their twisted roots and gnarled branches creating a labyrinthine maze. The sunlight barely filtered through, casting everything in a dim, eerie twilight. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant cry of an unseen bird. "Feels like the jungle's watching us," Rabbit muttered, his voice low. His usual nervous energy had been replaced by a wary tension. "Eyes on the prize, Rabbit," Mac replied, though he couldn't shake the feeling that the young private was right. The jungle felt alive, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something. After hours of trudging through the dense foliage, the team came across their first sign of trouble. In a small clearing, they found the remains of a previous patrol, a mangled mess of equipment, and what little was left of the men who had carried it. The scene was brutal, blood stained the ground, and the foliage was torn apart as if by some wild beast. Jesus Jinx breathed, his face pale as he knelt to inspect the remains. "What the hell did this?" Doc shook his head, his expression grim. "Whatever it wasn't human. Look at the way these men were torn apart. No animal does this, either." Mac scanned the tree line, his grip tightening on his rifle. "We're not alone out here. Stay frosty." As they pressed on, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The jungle seemed to close in around them, the trees looming like silent sentinels. Every rustle, every whisper of wind through the leaves, felt like the approach of something unseen. They came upon a narrow trail, barely visible under the thick undergrowth. Mac could tell it had been used before, though not recently. The ground was littered with old, rusted shell casings and remnants of battles long past. But among the debris, something caught Mac's eye. Scratched into the bark of a tree was a symbol he didn't recognize. It looked ancient, like something out of a forgotten religion. "Anyone know what this is?" Mac asked, tracing the symbol with his finger. Doc frowned, Studying it closely, it's not any military marking I've seen. Maybe some kind of local superstition. Could be, Mac replied, though he wasn't convinced. The symbol seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if the tree itself was cursed. As they moved on, the jungle seemed to grow darker, the air thicker with tension. The men's nerves were fraying, and even Mac found it harder to focus. The oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional distant thump of artillery or the haunting cry of a far-off animal. The team stopped to rest near a small stream, its waters black and still, reflecting the dark canopy above. As they sat, trying to gather their strength, a cold wind suddenly swept through the clearing, carrying with it a low, mournful moan that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "What the hell was that?" Rabbit asked, his voice trembling. "Sounded like the same thing from last night," Jinx replied, his hand resting on his rifle, eyes scanning the surrounding trees. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Mac saw something, a figure, pale and ghostly, drifting through the trees on the far side of the stream. It was barely visible, more a suggestion of a form than anything solid, but it moved with purpose, gliding silently through the undergrowth. "Eyes up," Mac hissed, bringing his rifle to bear. "We've got movement." The men snapped to attention, rifles aimed at the spot where Mac had seen the figure. But there was nothing, just the rustle of leaves and the slow, trickling sound of the stream. "What did you see?" Doc asked, his voice low and tense. "I don't know," Mac admitted, lowering his weapon slightly. But it wasn't human, and it wasn't friendly. The men exchanged uneasy glances. The jungle had always been an enemy, full of dangers both seen and unseen. But this was something different, something far beyond the horrors of war they had come to know. As night began to fall, the team set up a small camp, lighting a fire to keep the darkness at bay. The flames cast flickering shadows on the trees, but they did little to dispel the growing sense of dread. Mac took the first watch, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The jungle was alive with sounds, the distant calls of animals, the rustling of leaves, but it was the silence between those sounds that unnerved him the most. Then, just as he was beginning to think the night would pass without incident, he heard it again, the wail, low and mournful, drifting through the trees like a ghost. It was closer this time, and with it came the unmistakable sense of being watched. "Everyone up," Mac barked, kicking the others awake. "We're not alone out here." The men scrambled to their feet, weapons at the ready. But again, there was nothing, just the jungle, silent and still. "Mac, what is it?" Jinx asked, his voice tight with fear. Mac shook his head, his eyes scanning the darkness. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's hunting us." The wail came again, louder this time, and with it, a shadowy figure appeared at the edge of the firelight. It was just a glimpse, a flash of something pale and ethereal, gone as quickly as it had appeared. "We need to move," Mac said, his voice firm. "We're sitting ducks out here." As they packed up their gear, the wail came again, closer still, and with it came a cold wind that chilled them to the bone. The jungle was alive with the presence of something ancient and malevolent, something that had no place in the world of the living. And as they moved deeper into the darkness, the men of Firebase Ripcord knew they were no longer lost soldiers fighting a war. They were prey in a game they didn't understand, hunted by a force beyond their comprehension. July 1st, 1970. The sun had barely risen when Sergeant Mike Mac McAllister and his team resumed their march deeper into the Ashau Valley. The haunting wail they had heard the night before echoed in their minds, gnawing at their nerves. Each man was on edge, their senses heightened as they moved cautiously through the dense jungle. The oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on them, as if the jungle itself was alive and watching their every move. The air was thick with humidity, and the only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the crunch of leaves under their boots. But beneath it all was a pervasive silence that seemed to smother every noise, a silence that felt unnatural in a place that should have been teeming with life. As the day wore on, the team stumbled upon an old, partially buried bunker. The entrance was overgrown with vines and moss, almost hidden from view. The structure was decrepit, clearly abandoned long ago, but there was something unsettling about it, a sense that it had been left in a hurry, as if its previous occupants had fled from something terrifying. "Looks like an old NVA bunker," Corporal Jeff Jinx Johnson said, peering inside. His voice was tense, betraying the unease that had settled over the group. Mac nodded, signaling the others to stand guard as he and Jinx carefully entered the bunker. The air inside was stale and damp, and the walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that Mac had never seen before. "What do you make of this?" Jinx asked, his voice barely a whisper as he pointed to the symbols. "I don't know," Mac replied, running his fingers over the rough surface of the wall. The symbols felt ancient, older than the war, older than the jungle itself. "But I've got a bad feeling about this place." They found remnants of old supplies, rusted weapons, tattered uniforms, and a few scattered documents, all covered in dust and mold. But as they explored deeper into the bunker, the air grew colder, and a sense of dread settled over them. "We should get out of here," Jinx said, his voice shaky. "This place gives me the creeps." Mac nodded in agreement. There was something wrong about the bunker, something that made his skin crawl. As they turned to leave, Mac caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of his eye, a shadow flitting across the far wall. "Did you see that?" Mac whispered, his heart racing. "See what?" Jinx asked, looking around nervously. "I don't know, it was like a shadow, but it moved on its own," Mac said, his voice trembling. He didn't want to believe what he had seen, but the feeling of being watched was growing stronger by the second. They hurried out of the bunker, rejoining the rest of the team outside. The oppressive atmosphere of the jungle felt almost welcoming compared to the darkness within the bunker. "We keep moving," Mac ordered, trying to shake off the unease. But as they moved on, he couldn't help but glance back at the bunker, its shadowy entrance like a gaping maw waiting to swallow them whole. As they continued their patrol, the jungle seemed to grow darker, the canopy above thickening and blocking out the light. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and every step felt like it was taking them deeper into a place that time had forgotten. Then, without warning, the wail returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent, as if whatever was making the sound was growing impatient. The men froze, their eyes darting around, searching for the source. "There, Private First Class Charlie Rabbit Thompson shouted, pointing towards a cluster of trees." Max squinted, trying to see what Rabbit had spotted. Then he saw a figure, pale and ghostly, standing just beyond the tree line. It was barely visible, more a suggestion of a shape than anything solid, but it was there, watching them. "Hold your fire," Mac ordered, his voice barely above a whisper. It might not be real. The figure began to move, gliding silently through the trees towards them. As it drew closer, the air grew colder, and the sound of the wail intensified, becoming almost unbearable. "Fall back," Mac shouted, his instinct screaming at him to get his men out of there. They retreated, moving as quickly as they could through the dense undergrowth, but the figure followed, never getting closer, but never falling behind. As they ran, the jungle seemed to close in around them, the trees twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes. The air was filled with the sound of whispers, voices that seemed to come from all directions, speaking in a language none of them understood. "We have to keep moving," Mac shouted, his heart pounding in his chest. But no matter how fast they ran, the figure stayed with them, a relentless presence that seemed to be toying with them. They finally stumbled upon a small clearing and decided to make camp, their nerves frayed and their bodies exhausted. The figure had disappeared, but the feeling of being watched remained, an invisible weight pressing down on them. As night fell, they lit a fire, its flames casting flickering shadows on the trees. The jungle around them was alive with the sounds of the night, but the oppressive silence still lingered, a reminder of the unseen presence that had been following them. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," Rabbit admitted, his voice trembling as he sat by the fire, his rifle resting on his knees. That thing ... Whatever it was ... It wasn't human. No, it wasn't, Mac agreed, staring into the flames. He could feel the fear gnawing at him, threatening to take over, but he knew he had to stay strong for his men. But we have to keep it together. We're not out of this yet. The night was long and restless, each man taking turns on watch, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the ghostly figure. But the night passed without incident, the whale and the figure nowhere to be seen. As dawn broke, the men packed up their gear, ready to continue their mission. But as they prepared to leave, Mac noticed something strange. The ground around the campfire was disturbed, as if someone or something had been walking in circles around them all night. Did anyone see this? Mac asked, his voice filled with unease as he pointed to the tracks. The men shook their heads, their expressions fearful. The tracks were human, but there was something off about them, too long, too thin, and spaced too closely together, as if the person who made them had been moving with unnatural speed. It was here, Doc said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. It was watching us all night. Mac felt a chill run down his spine. Whatever was following them wasn't just a ghost. It was something far worse, something that had no intention of letting them leave the jungle alive. We keep moving, Mac said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. We have to finish this mission and get out of here. Whatever that thing is, we can't let it stop us. But as they moved deeper into the jungle, the feeling of dread only grew stronger. The ghostly figure may have disappeared, but its presence was still with them, a shadow that loomed over their every step. And as they marched on, each man couldn't help but wonder if they were marching towards their own doom. July 2nd, 1970. The morning mist clung to the jungle, giving it an ethereal, almost dreamlike quality. But for Sergeant Mike McAllister and his team, there was nothing dreamlike about their situation. The fear from the previous day's encounter with the ghostly figure had not dissipated. Instead, it had settled deep into their bones, making every sound, every movement in the jungle feel like a threat. The team continued their descent deeper into the Ashau Valley, the path ahead growing narrower and more treacherous. The jungle had grown thicker, the trees taller and closer together, their branches intertwining to create a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was cooler here, but also more oppressive, as if the jungle itself was pressing down on them. We're getting close to the coordinates, Corporal Jeff Jinx Johnson said, checking his map. His voice was tense, his usual bravado gone. Mac nodded, but he didn't respond. His mind was focused on the mission, but more than that, it was focused on the feeling that they were being watched. The jungle was silent to silent. The usual sounds of birds and insects were absent, leaving only the sound of their own footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. Around midday, they came across what appeared to be an old, abandoned camp. The remnants of tents, long since collapsed and covered in vines, were scattered around a small clearing. They were signs that people had lived here once. Rusted cooking utensils, a few rotting wooden crates, and even a faded photograph pinned to a tree. But there was no sign of life. This doesn't feel right, Private First Class Charlie Rabbit Thompson said, his voice trembling as he surveyed the scene. Why would they leave all this behind? Maybe they didn't leave. Doc, the team's medic, suggested grimly. He pointed to a pile of bones partially buried under the undergrowth. The bones were human, the remnants of what had once been soldiers. The sight of them sent a chill through the group. Mac knelt down, examining the bones. They were old, but not ancient, maybe a few years, at most. The skulls were cracked, some still bearing the marks of violence, while others looked as though they had been gnawed on by something. They were attacked, Mac said, standing up. But by what? Jinx shook his head. I don't think I want to know. The decision was made to make camp a short distance away from the abandoned site. None of the men wanted to stay too close to the bones, but they also didn't want to move too far in the growing darkness. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply, and the jungle seemed to close in around them. A fire was lit, its light barely penetrating the thick darkness that surrounded them. The men sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. The ghostly figure from the day before was still fresh in their minds, and the knowledge that they were not the first soldiers to die in this valley made their fear even more palpable. "Do you think it's coming back?" Rabbit asked, breaking the silence. His voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might summon the entity. Mac didn't answer immediately. He stared into the flames, the firelight dancing in his eyes. "I don't know," he finally said, "but we need to be ready if it does." As the night wore on, the men took turns on watch, but sleep was elusive for all of them. The jungle, which had been eerily silent all day, now seemed to come alive with sounds: twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the distant call of an unknown animal. But underneath it all was the faint sound of wailing, so quiet it was almost imperceptible, but unmistakable once you heard it. Mac was on watch when the wailing grew louder, moving closer to their camp. He stood up, gripping his rifle tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. The others stirred, waking up one by one as the sound penetrated their sleep. "It's coming," Jinx whispered, his eyes wide with fear. The wailing grew louder still, until it was echoing through the clearing, surrounding them. The fire flickered, as if being buffeted by an invisible wind, and the shadows cast by the flames began to dance and twist, taking on shapes that shouldn't have been possible. Suddenly, the figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was the same as before, pale, translucent, its features indistinct but undeniably human, but this time it was not alone. Several more figures emerged from the darkness, all of them sharing the same ghostly appearance. "Oh, God," Rabbit whispered, his voice shaking, "there's more of them." The figures began to move towards the camp, their wailing growing louder, filling the air with an otherworldly sound that seemed to penetrate their very souls. The men backed away, their weapons raised, but it was clear that bullets would be useless against these apparitions. As the figures drew closer, the temperature in the clearing dropped even further, their breath visible in the cold air. The fire sputtered and died, plunging them into darkness. The wailing became deafening, the sound reverberating in their heads, making it difficult to think, to breathe. Mac felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Doc, his face pale with terror. "We have to move." Doc shouted over the noise, but his voice seemed distant, as if coming from far away. Mac nodded, trying to gather his wits. "Fall back," he ordered, his voice hoarse. "We need to get out of here." The men scrambled to their feet, grabbing their gear and running towards the path they had come down. But the figures were relentless, following them through the jungle, their wails echoing in the darkness. As they ran, the jungle seemed to close in on them, the trees twisting and warping into grotesque shapes, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground beneath their feet became treacherous, roots and vines seeming to rise up to trip them, to slow them down. Mac could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the fear threatening to overwhelm him. But he forced himself to keep going, to keep his men moving. They had to escape, had to get out of this cursed valley before it was too late. They burst into another small clearing, panting and exhausted, but there was no time to rest. The figures were right behind them, their wailing filling the night with a sound that was almost unbearable. "We make our stand here," Mac shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "Get into position." The men quickly formed a defensive perimeter, their weapons raised, but the futility of the situation was clear. The figures were closing in, their ghostly forms shimmering in the darkness, their wails piercing through the night. As the figures approached, Mac felt a wave of cold wash over him, more intense than anything he had ever experienced. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he thought he could see something, images flashing through his mind, scenes of the past, of the men who had died in this cursed valley, their faces twisted in agony. The figures stopped just short of the perimeter, their wails fading into a low, mournful sound. They stood there, watching, waiting, as if daring the soldiers to make a move. "What do we do?" Sarge, Jinx asked, his voice barely audible over the sound. Mac stared at the figures, his mind racing. There was no way out. No escape from the nightmare they had found themselves in. But he knew one thing for certain: they could not give in to the fear. They had to fight, even if it was against something they could not hope to defeat. "We hold the line," Mac said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "We fight." And with that, the men opened fire, their bullets passing through the figures with no effect. But they kept firing, refusing to give in, refusing to let the terror consume them. The wailing rose again, louder than before, and the figures surged forward, passing through the line of soldiers, their cold, ghostly hands reaching out, touching, freezing. Mac felt a hand brush against his face, a sensation like ice burning his skin. And then the world went white as the wail reached a deafening crescendo. July 3, 1970. The night seemed to stretch into eternity. Time had lost all meaning for Sergeant Mike Mac McAllister and his team. They had fought through the night, their minds frayed by the relentless assault of the ghostly figures. Every round they fired was a futile attempt to stave off the inevitable, but the ghosts were impervious, their cold, dead eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to seep into the souls of the living. The first light of dawn broke through the thick jungle canopy, casting long shadows across the blood-stained ground. The ghosts had retreated with the coming of the sun, fading into the mist that clung to the valley floor. But they left behind a group of men who were forever changed. Mac wiped the sweat and grime from his brow, his hands trembling. The night's horrors were still fresh in his mind: the sight of his men firing into the dark, the sound of their terrified screams, the freezing touch of the ghosts. He looked around at his team. They were alive, but just barely. Corporal Jeff Jinx Johnson sat with his back against a tree, his eyes vacant and unfocused, his rifle lying forgotten in his lap. Private First Class Charlie Rabbit Thompson was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself, his face pale and drawn. Doc, their medic, was tending to one of the men who had collapsed from exhaustion, his hands shaking as he worked. "Is everyone accounted for?" Mac asked, his voice rough from lack of sleep and the constant tension. Doc looked up, his eyes dark with fatigue. "We lost Johnson," he said quietly. "He didn't make it through the night." Mac closed his eyes for a moment, the loss hitting him hard. Johnson had been a good soldier, one of the best. But whatever they were up against, it wasn't something a soldier could fight. "We can't stay here," Mac finally said, forcing himself to focus on the mission. "We have to keep moving." "Where are we going?" Rabbit asked, his voice laced with desperation. "What the hell are we doing out here, Sarge?" "We're going to finish what we came here to do," Mac said, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. "We're going to get those coordinates, and then we're getting the hell out of this valley." As they gathered their gear and prepared to move, the men were silent, their fear palpable. Every step they took felt like a march toward their own graves. The jungle, once a familiar enemy, now felt alive with unseen eyes, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. The descent into the valley continued, the path growing steeper and more treacherous. The air was thick and humid, the stench of decay and rot hanging heavy in the air. The ground was soft and wet beneath their boots, and more than once, one of them would stumble, only to be caught by another. "How much farther?" Rabbit asked, his voice a whisper in the oppressive silence. "Not far," Mac replied, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. The jungle seemed endless, the trees and undergrowth closing in around them, blocking out the light and suffocating any sense of direction. They were deep in enemy territory now, but the enemy they feared was not of flesh and blood. As they moved deeper into the valley, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The sounds of the jungle, once a constant background noise, had fallen silent. The air was thick with tension, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig causing the men to freeze, their hands tightening around their weapons. As the day wore on, the exhaustion and fear began to take their toll. The first to crack was Rabbit. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes wide with terror as he pointed into the jungle. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Something's out there. Mac looked in the direction Rabbit was pointing, but he saw nothing. There's nothing there, Rabbit, he said, trying to keep his voice calm. It's just your mind playing tricks on you. No, I saw it, Rabbit insisted, backing away from the spot. It was there, staring at me. The other men exchanged uneasy glances. They were all on edge, and the strain of the last few days was beginning to show. Mac knew they were close to breaking, but they couldn't afford to stop now. They had to keep moving, had to push forward. We need to keep going, Mac said firmly, putting a hand on Rabbit's shoulder. Stay close and don't lose focus. But, as they continued, the hallucinations grew worse. Each man began to see things out of the corner of his eye, shadows moving in the trees, figures lurking just beyond the edge of their vision. The jungle seemed to shift and twist around them, warping reality in ways that defied explanation. As night fell, the hallucinations became more vivid, more terrifying. Jinx was the next to lose control. He screamed and dropped his rifle, clawing at his face as if trying to rip something off of it. There in my head, he shouted, his voice breaking. Get them out. Mac grabbed Jinx, shaking him hard. Snap out of it, Jinx. There's nothing there. But Jinx was beyond reason. He pushed Mac away and ran into the jungle, his screams echoing through the trees. The others watched in horror, unable to stop him, their own fears threatening to overwhelm them. We can't just leave him, Rabbit said, his voice shaking. We have no choice, Mac said grimly. He's gone. The remaining men pressed on, but the jungle had become a nightmare. The trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The ground seemed to shift beneath their feet, and the air was filled with the faint sound of voices, whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Mac could feel the madness creeping into his own mind, but he fought to stay focused. The mission was all that mattered now. If they could just reach the coordinates, maybe they could find a way out of this hell. By the time they reached the base of the valley, only Mac, Rabbit, and Doc were left. They were exhausted, their bodies and minds pushed to the brink. The coordinates were just ahead, but the path was blocked by a dense thicket of trees. We're almost there, Mac said, trying to rally his men, just a little further. But Rabbit was on the verge of collapse. He dropped to his knees, his hands shaking. I can't do it. Sarge, I can't keep going. Mac knelt beside him, his own strength waning. You can do this, Rabbit. We've come too far to turn back now. Rabbit looked up at Mac, his eyes filled with despair. I'm sorry, Sarge, I can't. Before Mac could respond, the jungle exploded with sound. The ghostly wails from the night before returned, louder and more terrifying than ever. The trees seemed to come alive, their branches whipping through the air, lashing out at the men. We have to move, Mac shouted, pulling Rabbit to his feet. Now! They pushed through the thicket, the branches tearing at their clothes and skin. The wailing grew louder, more intense, as if the jungle itself was screaming in agony. Mac could feel the cold breath of the ghosts on his neck, the freezing touch of their hands reaching out for him. Finally, they broke through the trees and into a small clearing. The coordinates were just ahead, marked by a small, ancient stone altar covered in vines and moss. But as they approached, they realized that the altar was surrounded by the ghosts, hundreds of them, their pale, translucent forms shimmering in the darkness. Mac's heart sank. There was no escape. They were surrounded, trapped in a nightmare with no way out. We can't fight them, Doc said, his voice hollow. We're going to die here. Mac looked at the ghosts, their faces twisted in sorrow and pain. He knew Doc was right. There was no fighting this, no surviving it. But even as the realization set in, Mac felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The fear, the terror, it all began to fade away, replaced by a cold, numb acceptance. This is it, he said quietly, looking at his remaining men. This is where it ends. As the ghosts closed in, Mac closed his eyes, letting the cold embrace of death take him. July 4th, 1970. Dawn broke over Firebase Ripcord, but for the remaining soldiers, it brought no relief. The clearing where Sergeant Mike Mac McAllister, Private First Class Charlie Rabbit Thompson, and Doc had stumbled upon the ancient altar was bathed in an eerie, pale light. The ghosts that surrounded them stood motionless, their translucent forms flickering like the dying embers of a fire. There was an almost sacred silence in the air, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Mac, exhausted beyond belief, stood facing the altar. The weight of the mission, the countless lives lost, and the relentless supernatural torment had taken their toll. Yet, there was a strange calm in the midst of the chaos. He felt the icy grip of the ghosts drawing nearer, but he no longer recoiled in fear. Instead, he felt a deep sorrow, a connection to the spirits that had haunted them for days. "Why us?" Rabbit whispered, his voice barely audible. "What do they want from us?" Doc, his face gaunt and pale, looked towards the altar with a distant expression. Maybe it's not about us at all," he said slowly. "Maybe we're just here." The ghosts, sensing that the living were no longer resisting, seemed to hesitate, their hollow eyes fixed on Mac, as if waiting for him to make the next move. Mac approached the altar with cautious steps, the weight of the world on his shoulders. The stone surface was cold and rough under his touch, and the carvings on the ancient symbols and words in a language long forgotten glowed faintly as if responding to his presence. "Whatever happened here," Mac began, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides, "we're not your enemies. We didn't come to desecrate this place." As if in response, the wind picked up, and the ghosts began to wail, a mournful cry that echoed through the valley. Mac stood his ground, feeling a deep sorrow emanating from the spirits, an endless grief that had been festering for decades, maybe centuries. "They're lost," Doc whispered. "They don't belong here anymore. But they don't know how to leave." Suddenly, as if responding to the emotions in the air, the world around them shifted. The jungle faded away, and Mac found himself standing on the same ground, but in a different time. The stone altar was new, freshly carved, and the clearing was bustling with life. A group of people, villagers by the look of them, were gathered around the altar, their faces solemn and filled with sorrow. In the vision, Mac saw them offering prayers, laying down offerings, flowers, food, and trinkets before a man, dressed in ancient robes, raised his hands to the sky. The man began to chant in a language Mac couldn't understand, but the tone was clear. It was a ritual of protection, a desperate plea to the gods to save their land from the horrors of war that were closing in. But the vision darkened, the sky turned black, and the jungle was engulfed in flames. Soldiers' uniforms torn and blooded marched through the clearing, the villagers fleeing in terror. But the ritual had already been done, and the altar had become a focal point for the anger and pain of the villagers' spirits who were caught in the crossfire. As the vision faded, Mac was thrown back into the present. The ghosts surrounded them once again, but now Mac understood their torment. They were the remnants of those who had once lived there, trapped by the violence that had engulfed their home. Mac turned to his remaining men, his face set with determination. "We can't fight them, but maybe we can help them." "How?" Rabbit asked, his voice shaking. "How do we help ghosts?" "We finish what they started," Mac replied. "We offer them the peace they were denied." Without another word, Mac began to gather what few supplies they had left. He took out his combat knife and, using it with the precision of a man who had nothing left to lose, began to carve symbols into the dirt around the altar, symbols he had seen in the vision. Rabbit and Doc watched in silence, their fear momentarily forgotten as they followed Mac's lead. They laid down their last canteen of water, their last rations, and Mac's dog tags as an offering. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. As they completed the ritual, the ghosts began to move. The wailing grew louder, more frantic, but there was something different in it now. A sense of release, of long-awaited freedom. The air around them shimmered, and the oppressive darkness that had hung over the jungle for so long began to lift. The ghosts' forms started to dissipate, their faces softening as they faded into the morning mist. The temperature began to rise as the cold presence of the spirits vanished. The jungle returned to its natural state, and the silence was replaced by the sounds of the living forest, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves. The three men stood in the clearing, the weight of what they had just experienced settling in. The mission was over, but none of them felt like they had won. They had survived, but at a great cost. "We need to get back," Doc said quietly. "We need to report this, whatever it is." Mac nodded, but he knew that there was no way to truly explain what had happened here. The war would continue, and this place, this cursed valley, would be forgotten. Just another scar in a country already torn apart by violence. But as they began their long trek back to the firebase, Mac couldn't shake the feeling that they had done something important, something that mattered beyond the war, beyond the fighting. They had given peace to those who had been denied it for so long, and in doing so, maybe found a measure of peace for themselves. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.